This case was deemed a blueprint for survival. This was the joining of two complete strangers who became victims together and overcame their abductor in order to escape. This is their story of survival, and it also speaks on the child abduction epidemic of 2002 and kind of looking deeper into what that really was, possibly debunking it, while also discussing some of these cases that were linked to this so-called epidemic during that time period. These two girls were only teens, and yet they overcame this grown man with so much evil inside of him. You are such a genuine gem. Thank you for clicking on my video. I am Brooke Mckenna, and on this channel we focus on the victims and the survivors over the killers and the perpetrators. So if that's something you also feel passionate about, we would love to have you a part of this community. Before we dive in, I want to give a quick shout out to Tiki Solitaire Tri-Peaks. I mentioned this game before. I've been loving playing it, so if you want to use my link down below to download, you can download for free and grab 10,000 free coins. So go check it out. Now let's get back to the story. So it was back in 2002 in Lancaster, California, and 16-year-old Tamera Brooks was headed just outside of Lancaster to the Quartz Hill area. She was on a date with 18-year-old Eric Joshua Brown, who had picked her up in his Bronco that night. Quartz Hill was actually Avenue M and 47th Street West, known as this teenage hangout. It was a bit of a remote area, and lots of people would go on these dates. It was deemed lover's lane for the cars that were always parked there. So Tamera and Joshua decided to do the same on the evening of August 1st. Other couples were in cars, but only two girls would go missing that night from Quartz Hill, from their dates to fighting for their survival. And they didn't even know each other. Around 1 a.m., Joshua Brown found himself duct taped to a post, tied to it as well, and blindfolded as he was taken out of his own Bronco. An unknown man stole his vehicle and his date. However, there was also another girl inside of his car at the time that Tamera was kidnapped. You see, 17-year-old Jacqueline Marris was also on a date at Quartz Hill with her friend Frank Mallara. They were at this lover's lane that night. It was almost her curfew. They were about to leave, and they thought that it was something innocent that they could do to go on this Quartz Hill to keep them out of trouble. But Jacqueline was kidnapped at gunpoint from the vehicle she was with her date, and forced into Tamera's date's Bronco. Their male dates were both tied up, and they were instructed not to look at this man. They were told if they complied, nothing would happen. But both males were said to do exactly what they were told, but their dates were still kidnapped. When Frank was interviewed by police, he said that they were parked and he suddenly felt a cold object against his head. He quickly realized that this was a gun with a man's finger on the trigger. He remembers smelling alcohol in this man's breath as he demanded money, and he began getting out the duct tape and quickly becoming enraged. He was yelling at Frank, threatening him as though Frank did not believe that he was actually going to hurt him. Frank was telling this man that he was afraid of him. He had a gun. He knew that he could kill him in that moment. This man then duct taped his head to the headrest and his arms to the steering wheel, and his eyes were also covered. Now, from the sounds Frank could hear, he believed that his date Jacqueline was about to be tied up as well. However, the duct tape ran out in this moment, and Jacqueline was actually taken from the car, and Frank did not know where she went. So she was actually being forced into this Bronco, and Tamera and Jacqueline ended up being driven away from the scene. They were strangers to each other and seemingly to this man in the driver's seat. So Frank at this point managed to get himself out of these restraints, and when he knew it was safe, he called 911 on his cell phone. When he actually looked at the surroundings, he saw that there was another boy duct taped and tied up as well, but he was not inside of his vehicle. This ended up being Eric Joshua Brown, Tamera's date. Eric Brown stated that the man told him he did not want to kill him, he just wanted his Bronco. And this was actually all happening on Eric's birthday. So the LA County Sheriff's Department took the case as soon as the call and the abductions were reported. And Sheriff Brian Lindman told CNN and Breaking News that sometime between 1 a.m. and 2 a.m., a lone male suspect believed to be Hispanic based on his accent and in his 30s to 40s arrived in Quartz Hill in his his own vehicle. This man then proceeded to exit his own vehicle, which turned out to be a gray Saturn, and approached the parked vehicle where Tamera was seated with her date, Eric Joshua. And then he proceeded on to the car where Jacqueline was in with her date, Frank. The Ford Bronco that these teens were allegedly abducted in was described as a 1980s white and brown Bronco with a gray camper shell. They even had the license plate because this was Eric Joshua's car. And so an APB could be sent out about this Bronco to aid in the rescue of these teens. And the crime scene that they had left behind where they had been abducted, where this gray Saturn was now the focal point of the investigation. So they began to look into this vehicle. However, they quickly found that this was not going to lead them to the perpetrator because it was also connected to a crime. The gray Saturn had been stolen back in Las Vegas. The woman was actually approached at her home and placed into a headlock, and she began to scream until her husband actually came out to help her. The man then pulled a gun on them and stole $260 before driving off with their car. He then allegedly drove all the way to Lancaster, California. But before he drove off with these two girls he was abducting, he had allegedly attempted to set this Saturn on fire. He doused it in gasoline, but it was unsuccessful and the car did not end up actually burning down. But it also showed it had a blown out tire. So Sheriff Lindman reiterated that the couples did not know each other. These abduction victims had no idea who the other one was prior to this kidnapping, and that the perpetrator likely had no connection to any of them as well. But at this point, they did not know what direction this man went with the girls, but an Amber Alert was released. And this is something that was not common at this time. This is actually the first time California used the Amber Alert after it was created based on the 1996 kidnapping of Amber Haggerty in Texas. Everyone in the state was looking for this Bronco.
The kidnapping of 9-year-old Amber Hagerman happened in Arlington, Texas in 1996.
Almost, we really had no way to push a lot of information out instantly. Why the Amber Alert began was because of the frustration that we couldn't notify the public in a quicker manner. I mean, this was a tailor-made case. You know, often said if we'd have been smart enough to think of the Amber plan before this happened, we might have gotten her back because we actually had an eyewitness and a vehicle description. If we could have gotten that out very quickly to the masses, to the public, someone might have seen that pickup truck with her in it.
This was the first ever of its kind, so lots of people were not only afraid, but they were very, very aware. Highway signs everywhere were plastering the information about this Bronco to alert motorists, and hours were racing by, but investigators were rushing to find these teens before it was too late. Tips were coming in, but nothing that led them to an exact location. And meanwhile, the 16-year-old and 17-year-old girls who had never seen each other before were trusting each other in their fight for survival, and they began to not only bond, but to have this sort of alliance that would end up saving their lives. Both girls were said to be known for their friendliness, their confidence. They had gone to two different high schools, but both in Antelope Valley. And Jackie's mom, Nadine, said that her daughter was the eldest of three. She had very high energy. She had beautiful brown eyes, a trademark smile, and she was a cheerleader and a determined student, and she loved to surf. Her mom said that she had actually been aware of the recent abductions of young girls, and so she had warned her children that if they ever got abducted, it was likely they were not coming back. So they needed to do whatever it was that they could to get home. So Jackie's mother believed that Jackie would fight. She had too much life in her to go down without one. You see, what Jackie's mother was referring to was actually this time period where there were a lot of child abductions being covered in the media. This was known as the child abduction scare of 2002, or the summer of child abductions, at the same time that these teens were kidnapped. There was a number of high-profile abductions occurring in the U.S. and creating panic in the media. This is also what led many states to actually institute the Amber Alert, which was still rolling out at this time. A few cases were focused on during this time, one being the kidnapping of Danielle Van Dam. She was taken from her own bedroom in San Diego, California on February 1st of 2002. Now, I've actually covered Danielle's full case before, and I will have that linked down below for you if you would like to dive deeper. However, David Allen Westerfield was arrested 21 days later, and then 6 days after that, Danielle's body was found, and David Allen Westerfield was sentenced to death.
I've never in my career seen a case where someone has actually gone into a home, taken a child out of bed, and taken that child back to his home, sexually abused and taken the child away, killed the child, and dumped the body. The media's appetite for information in this case was insatiable.
But then the day after Danielle Van Dam's trial began, Elizabeth Smart was kidnapped from her home in Salt Lake City, Utah on June 5th of 2002. Now, we all know this incredible 9-month-long survival story. But this was huge in the media. Everyone everywhere knew about this case. But a month and 10 days later, another young girl vanished from in front of her home in Stanton, California. On July 15th of 2002, 5-year-old Samantha Runnion was kidnapped. It was known that a man had approached Samantha and her young friend when they were outside playing, and he was asking for help with a lost dog. He then forced Samantha into his car and he drove her away. And only a day later, her nude body would be found 50 miles away, and the death was brutal. It was compression of the neck and blunt force trauma to the head, and DNA connected a man named Alejandro Avila to the crime. Now, he had actually previously been acquitted of molesting his girlfriend's daughter and niece, but he was then sentenced to death in Samantha Runnion's murder.
But be brave comes from Samantha. My mom used to say, be brave, have fun, when she took her to school. And Samantha just owned be brave. She told her little brother every day, be brave. She'd leave us notes to be brave.
3 days after, Governor Gray Davis called Aaron to tell her he would be signing Amber Alert into law in California.
And less than 2 weeks later, the first 2 girls were rescued as a result.
And then on August 1st of 2002 was the kidnapping of the teens Tamera and Jackie. So 5 days after their abduction, President George W. Bush actually began talking about this child abduction problem and announcing that a White House conference was going to be about missing, exploited, and runaway children. It was believed that the intense focus on child abductions during this period on TV was the real epidemic, however. A lot of forces were said to become more media savvy around this time. They were rolling out the Amber Alert, which had many more of the community members involved. So some began to theorize that because more people were aware of these abductions, that is why it appeared as though they were happening more often, and it was this sort of epidemic when it really was just the coverage on it instead. Some also believe that there was fear after 9/11 and that the country had a heightened state of paranoia and basically fear of evil lurking nearby, and that also caused this uproar about the child abductions. But regardless of if this was an epidemic or not, these victims were still victims. And at this point, Tamera and Jackie were still in the hands of this man. And investigators had no idea who this man was or what he was going to do with them. But from the victim's point of view, Jackie had been forced into the Bronco that night. She had actually seen a pair of legs in the car, and she initially thought she was being placed next to a dead body. She soon learned that it was actually another teen and they were both being abducted. Now, Jacqueline and Tamera forged this bond in those moments, an unspoken pact that they were going to help each other get out of this situation. And meanwhile, investigators feared that they wouldn't be able to locate these girls, or even if they found the abductor and the Bronco, the girls would no longer be with them. 12 hours after their abductions, a tip came in from Milton Walters, who was a highway worker. This was around 11 a.m. and he spotted a Bronco on Highway 178. He looked into the car and he actually got a smile and a nod from the male driver. He believed that this was the Bronco that investigators were looking for. So he ended up calling the police, and the police nearby began searching the area. However, they were unable to find him. It was at this point in the Mojave Desert, and there were lots of little roads for him to have gone down. However, 45 minutes later, a woman would go to the local police station at 11:45 a.m. on August 2nd. This was Bonnie Hernandez, who was an animal control officer in Kern County, who was also driving down Highway 178. This was about 2 hours or 100 miles away from Quartz Hill when she came upon the Bronco. She immediately knew from the radio reports that she had been listening to, but she decided not to just call it in over her scanner in case this abductor was listening and could flee. So she immediately turned around and drove to the nearest town where she could get local law enforcement. 2 deputies started to go to this location and they were closing in on this Bronco. At this point, the Bronco was driving pretty fast down an embankment into a dry riverbed, and the police were pursuing, and soon enough the vehicle got stuck on top of this huge rock and the tires were spinning, but it was going nowhere. They were stuck, and so the police surrounded the vehicle and were met with the driver pointing a pistol at them. Little did they know he was already injured, but the girls were nowhere to be seen from the police perspective. Now, investigators at this point believed that they knew the identity of this man. A woman had come into the police department claiming that it was likely her husband who had abducted the 2 teen girls that morning. 37-year-old Roy Dean Ratliff, a Native American who was a husband and a father of 2. His friends knew him as friendly and smiley, but not many knew that there were 2 sides to this man. One sober and one uncontrollably violent. Roy worked at that time as a gardener for a child care center, but he was also a career criminal. He grew up in Nebraska, where he had a record dating back to the 1980s. He had prison stretches in Nebraska and California over the years for theft, for burglary, possession of meth, and in 1985, he was convicted of misdemeanor theft. The next year, he was convicted of felony burglary charges and sentenced to 18 months. And then in 1989, he spent 2 years in prison on second-degree burglary charges, but he was paroled after a year, and while on parole, he returned to prison for first-degree burglary. He was given 7 years, but was out in 3. So 3 years after that, in 1997, he was sentenced to 6 years for possession of a controlled substance. He was then paroled in July of 2001. However, he disappeared after his parole, and then he had an outstanding $3 million warrant in Kern County. This was a charge of 5 counts of SA of a 19-year-old in October of 2001 that he was never apprehended for. And under California's 3 strikes law, if he had been convicted of this, he would have faced life in prison. However, he disappeared, and the victim was allegedly his stepdaughter. It was believed that this is why his own wife turned him in. She said that he had even called her a week prior to the abduction to see his kids, but she refused. Now investigators had them in their sights, and inside the truck, investigators found restraints, rope, tape, 2 guns, ammo, and Viagra packages. But most importantly, the 2 missing girls. They ran out of the truck, they hugged, and they were bandaged at the scene before being taken to the hospital. They were said to be coherent, awake, and alert, but their condition was not discussed at this time. So the girls would survive to tell their own story. Tamera said that she thought Ratliff was a police officer at first when he came up to the window and that they were in trouble. But then she saw the gun pointed at Brown and he told them to give him all of his money. Tamera was terrified. She didn't even have a purse at this point. She was shaking but trying to appear calm and had the biggest lump in her throat. Tamera remembered that Eric Joshua kept telling the man that he didn't want to die, and she just kept praying silently. Jackie said that right at the start of their abduction, the bonding started, and she knew that she wasn't alone in this experience. Tamera said they never cried, not once, neither of them, not until they knew that they were safe. Tamera said that she was worried about God, just like Jackie, hoping that they wouldn't be sent to hell for killing this man, because that ultimately was their plan. So Jackie said that Ratliff drove them for a little while after the abduction before parking in a busy neighborhood area, and that's when he essayed them inside of the Bronco. She did not understand how nobody heard this happening. They were so close to homes, and she could see the light through a crack in her blindfold. It was believed that this was for this man's own sick excitement due to the fact that he was so close to people in this area. Ratliff then told them he was going to take them back to Quartz Hill. And while they didn't believe him, they were right not to trust this man because they could actually see the signs going by and knew that he was going in the opposite direction. About 30 minutes later, the teens were told that they could take off their blindfolds, and outside of this vehicle was pitch dark and a whole bunch of windmills in the middle of nowhere. More essay then occurred before Ratliff gave them his shirt to keep them warm. Jackie said that around this time her door was actually left open and she thought about her chance to escape. But she didn't move, and it wasn't due to being frozen in fear. It was due to the fact that there was a girl right next to her, and she wasn't sure that that girl would survive or be able to make it out if she tried to escape. This was a stranger she barely knew the name of, but had a desire to save. They wanted to survive this together. They began driving again throughout the night. A rope was tied around both of them, and the teens began to rub each other's legs for comfort. Jackie quietly sang to Tamera to calm her down, and then that's when Jackie grabbed Tamera's hand. She began tracing letters in order to speak to her without the listening ear of this abductor. She spelled out, "We need a plan." And Tamera wrote back, "Knife." Tamera knew that her date, Eric Joshua Brown, actually kept a knife in his Bronco. It was within reaching distance of the girls near the gear shift, and there was also a whiskey bottle. So the car stopped once again as these girls were trying to put together this plan, and they were in this remote area of the Mojave Desert. There was no one around, and that's when Ratliff actually got out of the car, took his 2 guns with him, and started loading them and firing them into the distance. And when he got back into the vehicle, after informing the girls without saying as much that the guns were in fact loaded, he then started to reach for that knife that they had planned on using against him. The girls held their breath, but miraculously, that's when Ratliff fell asleep. He was under the influence. He was so intoxicated that he actually passed out in that moment. At this point, the girls knew that they were not going down without a fight. Jackie actually began to lick at the duct tape around her wrists for the adhesive to actually come apart. And that's when the official plan was made. All through unspoken words, letters etched in each other's palms. They nodded together, counting to 3, and then they lunged at this man. Jackie grabbed the knife and stabbed Ratliff in the neck, while Tamera grabbed the whiskey bottle and hit him over the head. The intent was to kill him, to make him pay for the abduction and what he was about to do to them. Jackie wasn't sure if she was actually going to be able to stab him or that God would even forgive her if she did. However, when she grabbed that knife, she saw Ratliff's eyes flicker. She thought he was going to wake up, and she knew she had to move quickly. In doing so, they were able to make him bleed profusely, and at the same time, they shoved him outside of the car and immediately locked him outside, and Jackie immediately jumped in the front and tried to drive away. But that's when she found that the keys were not in the ignition, and this man outside still had his gun. So while they were somewhat safer, the gun was being pointed at them, and this man was telling them that he was going to shoot at them if they didn't let him back inside. He was counting down, about to shoot, and that is when he once again passed out and fell down just outside of the car. Just when they thought that they could breathe again, he actually stood up like out of a horror movie and began shooting inside of the car. The teens were begging for him not to kill them, and they began to tell him that God wouldn't forgive him if he did this. Now, this actually seemed to get to this man psychologically, and he calmed down. Finally, they let him back inside. They had no other choice, and that is when he started to pit them against each other. He saw that they were a force to be reckoned with together, and so he was telling them the first one to find his glasses was going to live because he couldn't handle them both. They refused to be pitted against each other at all, and so as he drove down this remote road called White Blanket, Ratliff started telling them that there better not be any police anywhere nearby, because if there were, he was going to kill them. But that's when the girls started hearing something, and they realized it was a helicopter in the distance. A helicopter that would help the deputies locate this Bronco in the desert. However, to the teens, this was a bad thing, because Ratliff just said if there was police, he was going to kill them. This is the point where they were located between Lake Isabel and Ridgecrest, and that's where the police standoff would occur with the suspect. He stated he was not going to stand down, and deputies said he looked very desperate. He sped off after having this altercation with them in the Bronco, and that's when he almost flipped the truck before getting stuck. Deputies at this point had no idea if the girls were in the truck, but Ratliff began saying that he had the girls and he would kill them if the deputies shot at him. It turned out that he wasn't lying, and the teens were actually hunched down in the back of the Bronco in the middle of everything. He allegedly shot at the officers, according to Jackie, and they began shooting back, though officers never confirmed if he did end up shooting first or not. So 17 bullets hit this vehicle in total. As Ratliff told the police not to shoot because the girls were inside, Jackie said that he actually looked her in the eyes while saying this, and she thought he was just trying to use them as hostages, but his eyes looked like he was in despair. And she said it was like he was telling the cops not to shoot the girls, as though he was protecting them. Officers claim that they shot Ratliff at this point, and he looked at them as though he was acknowledging that they finally had caught him. He then fell dead and landed on top of the girls. That's when they began to scream, and the officers knew for sure that they were not only in the vehicle, but they were alive. They pushed him off and actually ran out of the Bronco together. The survivors profusely thanked the officers. They stayed side by side. And Kern County Sheriff Carl Sparks stated, "We don't have to rehabilitate this son of a bee," because he was dead. He announced that he was certain that this kidnapper was minutes from killing the girls and had gone to this remote location to hunt for a place to kill them and bury them. He believed that Ratliff had chose to go down fighting rather than risk a return to prison, where he had spent the last 12 out of 13 years of his life. He believed they saved the girls within minutes of their murders. He said that this man was a two-striker. He was going to prison for the rest of his life, and he had nothing to lose, so he was going to get rid of them. Tamera and Jackie's families were informed that they were found and they were alive, and they spoke out to the media. Tamera's father, Sammy Brooks, thanked the media and the Amber Alert system, saying that it saved his daughter's life. He said, "I never lost hope. Tammy is a very, very strong-willed person. It's going to take her a while, but I think she'll recover from this. It runs in our genetic code." Now, Jackie's father, Herb Marris, said that he could not wait to see her. He even joked about making her curfew change to 8. Now, the victims of Ratliff's carjacking in Las Vegas, they spoke out too, saying that they were very thankful that the girls were all right, and they knew that that could have been them. Ratliff's wife, who ended up being a woman named Juanita, spoke to the families of Jackie and Tamera, saying that she was sorry and that she's glad that the children were okay. Now, the day after the rescue, while everybody was awaiting what these survivors were going to say and if they were going to come forward with their stories, considering they were still minors, Jackie actually gave an interview to KABC TV with her parents' consent. She really wanted to speak out. Jackie stated that they were trying to kill him because they could tell he had done this before. She said that she never thought something like this could happen to her, but she was thankful for everyone's prayers because they helped and God was listening. Now, 4 days after the rescue, Jackie and Tamera appeared on the Today Show, and they held each other's hands, and Tamera said that she was never going to leave Jackie alone. She said that when you see a life taken in front of your eyes, it's the worst feeling in the world. The two were very close to each other, and it was obvious that they were forever bonded from their survival. They combined their strength to fight off this captor. And they also spoke with zero shame, as they should, about the essay that occurred to them. And they were said to have a hand in changing the blaming of a victim when it came to essay during this time. This was said to be an extremely taboo subject that even if a victim wanted to speak out, they were told it was not a good idea. However, Tamera and Jackie, who were still minors at this time and whose names would have been kept out of the spotlight if that is what they so chose, they decided to not only speak out, put their names out there and their identities, but also to take back that narrative that they should be silent about what occurred to them. They and their mothers went on the Today Show and talked about what occurred to them, and their mother said that they were so proud of their daughters. Some of the media started to turn on the victims at this point because, of course, they weren't doing the normal narrative that the media wanted. While the media was saying that they just wanted their 15 minutes of fame, Tamera stated, "We want to get the message across to everybody to never give up on anything. Whatever obstacles you have, you've got to fight your way through it." These two survivors, they said exactly what they wanted to say. And not for fame, not for notoriety, but to help others. And it's disgusting that the media went against them in any way and tried to silence them. It's something that still happens today, but I can't imagine back then being at the forefront of victim advocacy and saying, you know what, we were essayed. This is something horrific that happened to us and we're not going to live in shame. And I praise them for doing so. They really set a precedent for all of the victims following in their footsteps. And it's incredibly brave and inspiring. But they did not do this because it didn't affect them. They did this because it did affect them greatly, and it was going to for years to come. At a welcome home party, these two strangers turned almost sisters, embraced, and Jackie actually sang to the crowd. She has a beautiful voice. But this story was so widely known in the media that the girls were sent cards, gifts, letters from other survivors thanking them, and they actually got to throw a pitch for the Giants baseball team. Jackie was spoken to in a documentary afterwards, saying that she struggled to actually think about what happened to her, and so she just tries to keep herself busy so she doesn't think about it. The trauma hits her unexpectedly at times, and the tears will come out at random. But overall, she's very happy she fought back. Jackie has been the most outspoken since the rescue. Tamera has been a bit quieter. That is her choice. We are not owed their story, their journey, their healing. We're not owed any of that, but I'm so grateful for what that they chose to share and their strength in doing that right after the abduction. About a month after their abductions in October of 2002, Sharon Brooks, who is Tamera's mother, as well as Tamera, were actually at that White House conference for the missing, exploited, and runaway children, and they were basically advocates for the children and the passage of the federal Amber Alert law, and both her and Tamera had become speakers on the importance of this alert. This caused a lot of the states that had not passed this law to really think hard about the good that it could do, and this case changed the lives of so many and helped so many future child abductions. But since then, these survivors have really stayed out of the spotlight, and you can only respect that. So as you can tell, the more we dove into this case of Jackie and Tamera and the media's kind of role in all of this, it does seem like the media frenzy that could have led to that child abduction epidemic scare that everyone was talking about. It seemed like this was very new. Nobody knew how to handle these things. It was all kind of chaos. There was even a point before the survivors kind of came out and spoke about what had happened to them, where an officer who was involved in this case actually came out and confirmed that they had been sexually assaulted. And this is kind of something that was very taboo. Everyone started panicking and taking down these stories that they had previously written about these survivors. And, you know, there was just a lot of backlash regarding that he shouldn't have been the one to confirm this at this time, especially since they were minors. And then media outlets were thinking, well, because they're minors and they're rape victims, we shouldn't be able to name them and talk about them. So they were taking it down. And so nobody really knew how to handle this situation. And so when the girls kind of spoke out, that is when I think a lot of things started changing as far as when you're speaking to a survivor, you have to let them tell their story. And if they want that to be part of it, that should be part of it. So I think that's why there's not a ton of information on this case, because a lot of people were very scared to talk about it, and that's heartbreaking to me. I just feel like they took back their power in those moments, and it is just a beautiful case of survival, of true teamwork, bonding, joining forces in order to escape when they previously had no connection. I mean, you think that in a survival mode, it would be all about you. You are going to do what you have to do to survive, and you don't care about everyone else. But it seems to me that in these scenarios, these people, they trauma bond. They begin to feel like their lives are connected, and becomes this team effort, this family that are determined not to let that be their fate, but also who are so selfless in their fight for survival that they would risk never surviving at all in order to make sure that they weren't the sole survivor. It just makes me emotional thinking about that Jackie had that car door open, that she likely could have run and gotten away, but she knew that both of them couldn't. So she sat there. She didn't know this girl before that night, and she chose to make that decision out of the goodness of her heart, out of her selfless soul. How beautiful. How beautiful that even in survival, we still choose love. We still choose humanity. And we still take care of each other. So let me know, have you ever heard about this survival story? Have you heard about the child abduction scare of 2002? And do you think it was merely just the media frenzy? Or do you think that there is something to it, and there was something in the water, or there was something that was occurring during that time that caused more child abductions than normal? I would love to hear your thoughts, and there will be a survivors playlist down below if you want to binge a bunch of those. You guys know I'm so passionate about that. So lots of cases on different survivors and their stories. But don't forget to speak up. Your voice is powerful enough, and I love you to absolute pieces. Okay, bye.